Hello, everyone. Hi, my name is Caitlyn Drinkwater. I think I know a few people here today. And today, what I want to talk about is cissexism in psychology. Personally, myself, this is kind of a conflicted kind of debate for me because I am personally studying to be a clinical psychologist at the moment. But at the same time, while it's a service that people want to get involved in because they want to help people, there's the dark side to psychology as well, and that it has been used as a tool of societal control. And we need to acknowledge that if we want to build better understandings and better mental health services in the future. So today, what we're looking at is just looking at some of the psychological theories that have been developed about transgenderism, particularly like Western concepts, and how they've shaped how we understand it today, and and how they have been used sometimes in helpful ways and sometimes in harmful ways. Now, you're quite an educated crowd here today, so I think some of you might recognize some of this material already, but bear with me, I'm sure we'll all learn something new. So, first thing to start off with is the terminology. Like I said, educated crowd, so I think most of these terms will be familiar. I will be focusing mostly on Western concepts of transgender, because one of the issues with psychology and Western ways of thought is that we like to pretend that it's somehow an essential truth. So transgenderism is often being acted like it's true for everyone, whereas we might be changing that way now. In previous decades, this was seen as being like a scientific basis for how the world works. So yeah, aside from that, we'll also be using the words transsexual, which is someone who transitions from one sex to the other, which is like what's been used for most of the history. And then we have transvestite, which is when someone prefers to present as the other gender, but they don't feel like they identify. You all know this stuff, but yeah. I also want to point out the term cisgender, which is basically a term that's used to refer to someone who doesn't feel any sort of tension or ambiguity or any sort of non-conventional relationship with the birth sex. In many ways, you can compare it to heterosexuality, in that heterosexuality is considered the norm when compared to homosexuality. Cisgender is often considered to be the norm when compared to transgender. So building on this assumption of cisgender, there's also cissexism. And cissexism refers to the idea that in our culture, the gender binary is natural, essential, and it's the norm. And people fall out of that. While a more aggressive stance might be that they're in some way pathological, it can also just be that they're unusual. Just the assumptions for welcome and one on campus is how we always have to have gender change rooms and gender bathrooms, and the conflicts that raises for people who don't fall into either of those signs. Now, another thing to focus on is why women? The reason why I brought this up is because a lot of academic literature and a lot of research in the past has focused on transfemininity. Often, trans masculinity has been marginalized or played down, and people who fall out both of those categories tend to kind of be dismissed or kind of treated like they're confused, which is the usual bisexual stance in a way, and that they're don't fully understand, or that they're they're one way or the other and they're just afraid to commit. There's been several explanations for why this assumption is used. One has been stated that some people just like to say that, well, trans women tend to be more common statistically, which, that's a bit debatable. And another one is that trans men also or trans masculine individuals find it easier to pass in our culture, and so they stand out less more, so they attract less attention, which, once again, is very conflicted and not always accurate. Personally, I feel like we have to acknowledge the fact that trans femininity, much like cisgender femininity, has often been sort of treated as an exotic commodity. In many ways, the transgender body has been seen as a situation which is focused for ridicule or derision, but also sometimes as supposed to be evocative. With this way, it's mostly being focused on. And there's also the issue that often the idea that someone who is born male would discard their male privilege and like assume the status of a woman who's often seen as being second class in a more heteronormative society, is seen as being in some way irrational or in some way, you know, just acting in an illogical fashion. Okay. So moving on to the early theorists, while we have like a lot of focus on, well, like I said, like science likes to pretend that it's founded in the central truth, it has also been shaped by like a lot of early theorists, mostly coming from the 19th century, when people started to form the first schools of thought about sexology. Like one of the first people to theorize this was Karl Heinrich Ulrich. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Am I? Good. But yeah, Karl came up with the idea of earnings, which was one of the first ways that like male femininity was theorized. It's often been kind of portrayed in the past as like being a form of like an early form of homosexuality. This isn't entirely true, because like in some ways he would talk about how you know, he saw an earning as someone who has a feminine psyche in a male body, which is, you know, almost taken out of a biography from like the 90s or something. Ulrich was also like quite progressive for his time. He self-identified as an earning himself, and he would argue that earnings and also other variations were part of the natural human variation of gender identity and sexuality. The problem is, at the time, not many people agreed with Ulrich. In the 19th century, there was like a huge focus on theories of degeneracy, and the idea that like in some ways that human population and reproduction had to be controlled in an attempt to maintain the purity of the race and just basically stop humanity from just breeding itself out of existence, which is a wacky idea, but like it was quite popular back in the day. So earnings theories often got corrupted by others, and they were used to kind of develop a sort of theory of the deviancy, and they became the basis for like certain like what we're seeing as sexual pathologies. One of the key theorists when it came to devising these sexual pathologies was Richard von Krafft-Ebing, up there. He wrote a book called Psychopathia Sexualis. This was one of the earliest sexological texts. In fact, it might be the first one. And he included like a lot of talk about like about maladaptive gender and sexual instincts. And you know, this was a theory that was quite common at the time. And it kind of was the norm until about the early 1910s, when we move into the era of into Magnus Hirschfeld. Magnus Hirschfeld, who is who opened up the Institute for Sexuology in Germany. Hirschfeld was like really ahead of his time. He defined the terms transvestite and transsexual as we understood them today, and for most of the 20th century. And his clinic actually started to offer some of the first hormonal and surgical interventions for trans people. A classic case of this is Lille Elbe, who was, I think they were an artist, but they became like a model. And they also, they had quite a few of the early surgeries performed on themselves, including an attempt at like a womb transplant, which unfortunately wasn't too successful. And yeah, so Hirschfeld, once again, was much like Earnings. Hirschfeld identified as a gay man, and he also felt that this was part of human variation, and he would advocate for like the decriminalization of homosexuality, and was very progressive. But unfortunately, in 1933, there were certain political difficulties that we might all know about, and Hirschfeld's institute was shut down by the Nazis, along with Hirschfeld passing away sadly a couple of years later. The thing is, while the institute was shut down, like these surgeries would still occasionally practiced throughout the West. Not usually in very legitimate areas. Like quite often, surgeons would have to be doing it behind closed doors, and it could be quite difficult to find access. But as these surgeries happen, like the stories like of them started to leak into the press. Like the classic example is Christine Jorgensen, who's often seen as like being the first person to have ever sex change, which problematic language all around, but it's also not entirely accurate, but following on from Christine Jorgensen, there was a great amount of interest. Like there was, as you saw, there was like at least 2 movies. There was I Changed My Sex and Glenn or Glenda. And it became kind of notorious things happen. And while initially there was like a lot of, initially it was basically this attitude of if you could find a surgeon, you could find someone who agreed to it, then you kind of go there and you pay for it and hope for the best, because obviously not done in the most legitimate, not exactly a regulated practice either. And this so this sort of like freedom and sort of like first come, first serve attitude towards surgery was kind of changed in the 60s with the arrival of gender identity clinics. The one that's seen as being the first, or at least the first in the USA, is the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic. This was founded by three individuals. There was, just having a look at, Harry Benjamin, Richard Green, and John Money, who I could kind of do a talk on just entirely on John Money, because, anyway, moving on, fascinating individual for problematic reasons. But yeah, so John Money, the Johns Hopkins Clinic became very popular because Harry Benjamin would write on this. Like in 1966, he published a work called The Transsexual Phenomenon, which really entered the mainstream press, and following the publishing of that article, they had a response of about 700 individuals contacting the services for surgery. But whereas like previously, like it was treated as a medical process, the Johns Hopkins Clinic had this idea that like the surgeries and access to interventions had to be regulated, that like you had to screen to make sure that like the wrong people weren't getting involved. And to see if someone was appropriate, that usually meant how well can they perform traditional femininity, or how well can they perform traditional masculinity. So, you know, it kind of, it's been like, it's still reported today, but like people are expected to like go and present in very like conventional ways, and they will get called out on the smallest details of not being gender conforming. And at the same time, you had to obviously be heterosexual, and you had to be secretive. You couldn't be public about your identity as well, because that was seen in some way transgressing gender norms and just not performing your identity properly. Which, like, the enforcement of these sort of regulations also became like, the enforcement of these regulations also became one of the greatest criticisms of transgender people in themselves. Like, if you look at like a lot of the criticism in the 70s, especially amongst like some schools of feminism, there was this idea that transgendered women and transgendered men, to a lesser extent, reinforce the gender binary, because they take gender variant people and then they shape them to be more gender conforming. And often that was seen as like being the fault of the trans person themselves, rather than like, you know, that's what they had to do if they wanted access to surgery. But while there was like criticism from outside, it wasn't really accepted within like psychology and also the medical services themselves. Because most notably in 1975, there was a psychiatrist named Paul McHugh, and he took over the, he was very staunchly against the Gender Identity Clinic. And when he took over the psychiatry department, he had a vested interest in shutting down the clinic. Most notably, he hired Myers to write a report, John Myers, who was a researcher, to write a report about like the results of the identity clinic and to see how well people were performing. And this led to the criticism in Myers' report that like surgery was not conducive to people's sociological functioning. And Myers would also criticize, which I think for us kind of shows what they were aiming for. He would say that like he saw the problem being as they were all not really turning men into women or women into men. They were instead creating third genders, and he saw this as being very problematic. So yeah, this eventually led to like McHugh being successful in his endeavors, and in 1979, the clinic was closed down. And like while people would still go there because of the name of the clinic, they would often be held just in constant psychoanalysis and never actually receive any surgery. But yeah, but alongside this sort of this deciding on this mode of treatment of transgender people, there was also growing interest into the nature of transgenderism. Sorry, I'm seeing some looks on people's faces. But yeah, and this led to like in the 80s, there was a guy named Ray Blanchard who's still quite successful today, and he came up with his idea of the transsexual typology. In his theory, there are basically two types of transsexuals, and transsexuals was the term he used. So first, there was like the homosexual transsexuals, who were usually younger, and there would be young gay men who felt conflicted about their identity, but who felt conflicted about their sexuality, but wanted to be presentable to heterosexual men. So they would transition in an attempt to attract those men. And then the other half was the autogynephilic transsexuals, who were defined as older heterosexual men who were aroused at the idea of having a female body, and so would transition just to fulfill their arousal. You might notice this theory leaves absolutely no room to discuss people who fall outside of transfeminine spectrum. And it wasn't the most popular theory amongst like transgender people themselves. I mean, there's like quite a few criticisms. Like the first one is that, as many transgender women have stated, that they feel this theory doesn't reflect their experiences. Some say they do, but on the majority, it tends to be criticized for like just kind of having no relation to people's lives. The response to this is the classic psychoanalytic response, which is, well, obviously these people are repressing and distorting their memories, and it's actually true, but they can't admit it to themselves that it's true. Another criticism is that like researchers who use the measures that like that Ray Blanchard used find more variation. They don't find that the individuals they look at fall neatly into these two categories, and you know, this also is responded with the classic criticism of like, well, these people don't know how to do my studies properly, and if you follow my instructions, then you will find these two categories. And the third criticism of that is that like Blanchard's results were mostly based on a narrow sample, as he went to a specific clinic and interviewed like people who were patients at the clinic. Now, of course, this brings in, anyone who knows anything about research will know this brings in biases with like just like location and race and like just and class as well. But there's also the issue that since these people were recruited from a clinic, they made themselves feel pressure to present certain identities themselves in an attempt to be accepted by the psychological profession as being authentic and being able to receive like medical intervention themselves. Okay. Yep, so Blanchard's theory wasn't really resigned to the worlds of academia. It eventually passed over into popular consciousness. With one notable example, one notorious example, is J. Michael Bailey's The Man Who Would Be Queen, which was published in 2003. And yeah, as you can see, even from the title and the cover image, it's kind of trying to highlight that sense of like, of an incongruity between like, you know, the sex and gender and the confusion of like, of the patients he was talking about. It's been a highly criticized work, like not only because it promotes autogynephilia theory, which a lot of people aren't happy with, but also because it's quite disparaging and dismissive of the people it talks about. At one point, J. Michael Bailey feels free to point out that, you know, this, I think the exact quote was something like, "There's no nice way to say this, but you know, homosexual transsexuals are much more better looking than autogynephilic transsexuals," which is an interesting comment to make, but there's definitely been a theme of like academics feeling it's quite appropriate to comment on them transgendered individuals' presentation. But the thing is, coming out in 2003, it kind of met with the growing trans activist movement, with the notable critic being Julia Serrano, who's still quite active today, and she wrote in a book, The Whipping Girl, which I really highly recommend, about like how damaging Bailey's theories were and like how inaccurate they were to experience, and also how shaming they were, because they kind of define sexuality as being based on male sexuality. that is a response either to people wishing to obtain male sexuality or fulfill male sexual desire. So this has a twofold effect of not only defining women by like male concepts, but also by stating that that transsexuals, a good transsexual should not have this desire, that in some way it pathologizes individuals to like be sexual. And like that's been a criticism, that like it kind of shames people into like denying any form of sexuality for themselves or like for other people, that they have to perform this very conventional, almost asexual like identity. But moving along from like autogynephilia theory, there's also been like the Harry Benjamin standards of care. This was kind of like developed around the same time as like the clinic, as the original Johns Hopkins clinic was closing down, and this just dictates what was seen as what was seen as being appropriate for an individual to go through before they should seek surgery. The idea behind this was that like if the inappropriate individual did not get in, it would be so psychologically damaging that they would never recover, and so they need to be tested. This includes, like, as stated before, like psychological evaluations, but it also contained like the highly critical stance of the real life test. This dictated that like people should spend like a certain amount of time in their preferred gender, and also, you know, they should maintain a job or some sort of like, or study or something which shows that they have some sort of standing in the community that proves that they can function. It's controversial, like some people will argue that like it's a good way for people to get to know what they really want and just learn if they feel that medically transitioning is appropriate for them. But there's also been the criticism that it's a form of hazing, basically, a form of gender hazing, in that it kind of requires like the transgendered individual to place themselves in a position of vulnerability in order to receive approval from like medical professionals. It's also been quite variably used, like this quite common that's to say that it's like 1 or 2 years before genital surgery, which a lot of people will say, well, that's a big thing, maybe that should be omitted. But in the first edition of the Standards of Care, it also dictated that like an individual would need 6 months of real life tests before they could have non-genital surgery. So this includes things like nose jobs and liposuction, which I think kind of shows how transgender bodies are seen as being, they're seen as being needed to be more policed. If you took like a cisgendered individual, terminology all over the place, if you took a cisgendered individual and they wanted surgery, they would not have to go through the same rigorous psychological testing before they would be deemed appropriate for surgery. And it also has been noted that typically these more conventional cosmetic surgeries or like facial surgeries tend to have much more like post-surgery regret when compared to like surgical transitioning, gender reassignment, because obviously there's a lot more process that goes on behind it. And so, yeah, standards of care, a bit controversial. Now, I've kind of been a bit negative in this entire talk. I feel like I've kind of been saying like, oh, practitioners are bad, terrible people, they just want to control us. But most people who get involved in like mental health and medical systems, they do so because they want to help people, even if it's not always expressed in the best ways. But this idea of wanting to help people has seen like in recent days like more of a shift to like more client-focused care. Like in New Zealand, we've recently had the Transgender Care Pathways project, which, you know, where like they've been trying to reach out to like the transgender community in Auckland and just talk to them to say like, hey, what do you think you need? What would be appropriate? And this includes not just like psychological assessment for surgeries, it also includes working with families, access to like social services, or, you know, even just getting in touch with community support, which personally I think is quite a positive change. It'd be interesting to see how it develops. But there's also kind of been a backlash to this. With this increased access and increased acceptance of transgender people and acceptance of people expressing themselves in non-gender binary ways. There's been some people who've said that like this is enabling delusion. And includes like our old friend, Dr. McHugh, who recently resurfaced and writing a piece called Surgery is Not the Solution. And he says this, and he has this quote where he says that claiming that transgender rights is a civil rights matter and encouraging surgical intervention is in reality to collaborate with and promote a mental disorder. And this, like, it kind of shows like how, like, I think in a way it sums up just how like mental health discourse and, you know, the disease pathology is used to like kind of undermine how people feel about themselves and take ownership. Because what he's really saying here is that these people do not know themselves. They do not know who they are. And it's really up to a trained medical professional, such as the lovely Dr. McHugh himself, to really make a judgment on who someone is and how they should be allowed to present themselves. And that's the end of my talk today. I hope I haven't been too grim. I feel like I've been saying lots of growly things. Yeah, it's been like a very medical talk. It's been a lot of stuffy academics arguing backwards and forwards, but I really think like it helps us to understand just like how we developed understandings today and how people learn to understand like how gender should be performed and how transgender people are supposed to be. So I hope you enjoyed it.